And it says, verse 3, that they led him away to Annas first, for he was father-in-law to Caiaphas, which was the high priest that same year. So he's taken first to Annas, the father-in-law of the actual high priest that year, Caiaphas. And while the apostles have scattered and run away in fear, which Jesus told them would happen, it says, verse 15, Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. That disciple was known unto the high priest and went in with Jesus into the palace of the high priest. Implication is that this is John the Beloved, the author of this book, that he's known that he gets in somehow. Don't know for sure, but he's now going to be telling the story from the inside. And Peter is standing at the door without. And then went out that other disciple, which was known unto the high priest, and spake unto her that kept the door, and brought in Peter. So Peter is now brought in to this inner court of Caiaphas's palace, where Jesus is being tried. Verse 17, Then saith the damsel that kept the door unto Peter, Art not thou also one of this man's disciples? And he saith, I am not. So at that point in your mind, you would think, okay, strike one. Jesus told me I was going to deny knowing him 3 times before the cock crows.
Remember, we did in just a prior lesson that the circle of learning is closed with feedback and reflection. Now, Peter's received feedback in advance, but apparently he hasn't reflected. And so he's going to keep repeating this mistake until he reflects enough and realizes, I need to make a change and be fully converted, fully turned to the Lord.
Yeah, so this is a difficult passage. Years ago at BYU, President Spencer W. Kimball gave a talk called Peter, My Brother, a great talk where he had read recently some articles where people were making fun of Peter for this experience and dragging his name through the mud. And here's President Kimball standing up for this chief apostle saying,
and in a very similar position, Peter eventually had all the keys, and President Kimball is now standing in Peter's position as the chief apostle. So he has an affinity towards this man.
Absolutely. And he's basically saying, don't point fingers of scorn at Peter, my brother. He talked about the significance of Peter's role in the premortal councils and at the creation, and his role as the chief apostle through 3 years. And then if there was any wrongdoing here, Jesus completely forgiving him, and he is the chief apostle up until his death at the hands of Nero. So we're not pointing fingers of scorn or accusation at Peter. We're trying to learn principles that are applicable in our life from Peter's story here. Look at verse 18. And the servants and the officers stood there, who had made a fire of coals, for it was cold.
Yeah, it's like, what, late March, early April?
It's late March, early April, and it was in the middle of the night, and when those dews come down, and it can get very chilly. And we can't picture all of the agonies that Jesus endured for us, but have you ever thought about the fact that we do know a couple of details? It was a cold night. And when Jesus was out in the garden, bleeding from every pore, it's cold, to add to all of the infinite agonies and all of the eternal prices that are being paid. There's also that physical element that Jesus is enduring for us. It's such a small detail. It was cold. But for me, it becomes one of these significant additions to the story because I can at least wrap my head around that part. I can at least understand him enduring that part of the bitter cup for us, even though it's infinitesimally small compared to all of the agonies that he's enduring. And so here's Peter warming himself, standing with them. And then verse 19, the high priest then asked Jesus of his disciples and of his doctrine. And Jesus answered him and said, I spake openly to the world. I ever taught in the synagogue and in the temple, whither the Jews always resort, and in secret have I said nothing. So in verse 21, he says, Why askest thou me? Ask them which heard me what I have said unto them. Behold, they know what I said. And when he had thus spoken, one of the officers which stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, Answerest thou the high priest so? Oh, the irony is thick. Jesus is the high priest of all high priests, and he just got struck on the face by this servant of the high priest. That face that minutes ago, half hour ago, was on the ground in Gethsemane, suffering intense agony. And now Jesus says, if I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil, but if well, why smitest thou me? Now Annas had sent him bound unto Caiaphas the high priest, and Simon Peter stood and warmed himself. And they said therefore unto him, Art not thou also one of his disciples? He denied it and said, I am not. There's number two. More pressure. And one of the servants of the high priest, being his kinsman, whose ear Peter cut off, saith, Did not I see thee in the garden with him? And Peter then denied again, and immediately the cock crew. I love something that I learned many, many years ago from Michael Wilcox when he was teaching this section. He said, if you're Peter and you want to make sure you're not going to be tempted to deny knowing Jesus, you probably want to avoid Caiaphas's palace that night, rather than going to the very place where it's most likely that you're going to be tempted to deny him. Again, we're not accusing Peter. We're trying to take this story from Peter's context and figure out what lessons Peter might be able to teach us today if he were standing here today. I think it's possible that Peter might say to you and me, don't go to a place where you know you have a propensity or a weakness to perhaps give in to that weakness. Avoid that place. Go somewhere else. Don't think that we're stronger than the temptations in certain settings. And isn't it interesting that the animal that Jesus used, again, not applying to Peter, but to Tyler in this context. The animal, as we apply this story, is the rooster. The cock was going to crow. Immediately, the cock crew. Isn't that interesting how nature has an alarm clock, a wake-up call, if you will? It's the rooster's crow. And isn't it interesting how often I go into situations thinking, I got this, I'm going to be strong. And I go in kind of cocky, if you will, and then in the moment of temptation, sometimes turns out I recognize that I'm chicken, and I give in, and I fall. I love the fact that for the rest of Peter's life, he's not holding himself hostage to these three denials. But every morning moving forward that Peter wakes up and hears a cock crowing, it's once again a reminder, a wake-up call for him that when he was fully converted, he would strengthen his brethren. And that's what we see. This to me is not a let's make fun of Peter for a moment of denial. This is a moment of glorying in the fact that Jesus is willing to work with us through moments of weakness and give us those wake-up calls and to help us be strong and faithful and more powerful than ever before. I love this story and this perspective of Caiaphas's palace. And to acknowledge the fact that I know certain places, certain things, I can't trust myself. So it's best I just stay away from those Caiaphas's palace in my life.